If you're over 50 and you haven't looked closely at your 401k in years, just letting it sit there, assuming it's handled because it's automatically invested somewhere, I need you to stop and pay attention right now, because this is exactly the age where the mistakes people make with this account become almost impossible to undo later. And by the end of this video, you'll know exactly what to check, what to change, and what almost nobody tells you before it's too late. Here's the uncomfortable truth. The 401k strategy that made sense for you at 30 is not the same strategy that makes sense at 50, 55, or 60. Your account doesn't know your age. It doesn't automatically adjust just because you're getting closer to retirement. If you set it up once, decades ago, and never touched it again, there's a real chance it's still invested exactly the way it was when you had 30 more years to recover from a market crash. And that's a very different situation than the one you're actually in now. Let's start with the single biggest thing people get wrong after 50. They leave their 401k allocated exactly the way it was in their 30s and 40s, heavily weighted toward aggressive growth investments, mostly stocks, very little balance toward stability. When you're young, that makes complete sense. You have decades to ride out downturns. A market crash at 35 is barely a blip by the time you retire. But a market crash at 58, right before you're planning to retire, can be devastating because you don't have 30 years left to wait for a full recovery. You might only have 5 or 10 years before you need to start actually living on this money. This is exactly why age-appropriate rebalancing matters so much right now. As you move through your 50s, your portfolio generally should start shifting gradually, not overnight, not in a panic, but steadily, toward a more balanced mix of stocks and more stable assets like bonds. This doesn't mean abandoning growth completely. You likely still have 15, 20, even 30 years of retirement ahead of you, which means some continued growth exposure still makes sense. But it does mean the extremely aggressive all-in-growth allocation that made sense at 30 needs to evolve into something more balanced, specifically designed to reduce how hard a downturn could hit you right before or right after you stop working. Here's a check you can do literally today, in under 5 minutes. Log into your 401k account and look at your current asset allocation. The breakdown of what percentage is in stocks versus bonds versus other holdings. If you genuinely don't know what you're looking at, or if it's been years since you actively chose this allocation, that's your first sign that this account needs real attention, not just passive faith that it's probably fine. Now, let's talk about something equally important that gets completely ignored by most people over 50, catch-up contributions. Here's what a lot of people don't realize. Once you turn 50, the government actually allows you to contribute significantly more to your 401k each year than younger workers are permitted to. This is called a catch-up contribution, and it exists specifically because lawmakers recognize that people often need to accelerate their savings in these final working years before retirement. If you're not taking advantage of this and you have any room in your budget to contribute more, this is one of the most valuable tax-advantaged opportunities available to you at this stage of life. And an enormous number of people over 50 simply don't know it exists, or know about it, but never actually increase their contribution to take advantage of it. Let's talk about employer matching next, because this is money that's simply being left on the table by more people than you'd expect. If your employer offers any kind of matching contribution, and you're not contributing enough to capture the full match, you are quite literally leaving free money unclaimed every single paycheck. This is one of the only places in personal finance where you get an immediate, guaranteed return on your contribution, no market performance required. If there's any flexibility in your budget at all, getting the full employer match should be one of your top financial priorities, full stop. Now let's talk about the old 401k accounts. A lot of people are quietly ignoring. The ones sitting with previous employers. If you've changed jobs at any point over your career, there's a good chance you have old 401k accounts scattered across former employers, sometimes forgotten entirely. This matters more than people think, for a few reasons. First, these old accounts are easy to lose track of. Literally, some people forget they even exist. Second, old employer plans sometimes carry higher fees than what's available elsewhere, quietly eating into your returns year after year without you noticing. Third, having your retirement savings scattered across 4 or 5 different old accounts makes it dramatically harder to manage your overall allocation and strategy as a coherent whole. The fix here is usually straightforward. Consider consolidating old 401k accounts, either by rolling them into your current employer's plan if allowed, or into an individual retirement account commonly known as an IRA. This isn't a requirement, and there are some situations where leaving money where it is makes sense. But for most people, consolidation makes it dramatically easier to see your full picture clearly, manage your allocation intentionally, and potentially reduce the fees you're paying across multiple scattered accounts. Let's talk about fees more broadly, because this is one of the quietest wealth drains in the entire retirement savings system. Every 401k plan charges some level of fees: administrative fees, fund expense ratios, sometimes advisory fees layered on top. These percentages sound tiny in isolation, often less than 1%, but over 20 or 30 years, even a seemingly small difference in fees can add up to a genuinely significant amount of lost growth. Take the time to actually look up the expense ratios of the funds you're invested in within your 401k. If you're in expensive, actively managed funds when lower cost index fund options are available within the same plan, switching can meaningfully improve your long-term outcome without changing your risk level at all. Now let's talk about something people over 50 specifically need to start thinking about, that younger workers generally don't: the actual withdrawal strategy, even though retirement might still be several years away. Here's why this matters now, not later. The decisions you make in your 50s and early 60s about how your 401k is invested directly shape how vulnerable you are to something called sequence of returns risk. Essentially, the risk that a market downturn happening right before or right after you retire does outsized damage, because you're forced to either withdraw money at a loss or drastically cut your spending at exactly the wrong moment. Planning for this now, years before you actually retire, gives you time to adjust your allocation gradually and thoughtfully, rather than being forced into a reactive scramble the year before you stop working. This is also exactly the stage of life where working with a fee-only fiduciary financial advisor can provide enormous value. Someone legally required to act in your best interest, who can look at your specific 401k, your specific timeline, and your specific retirement goals, and help you build an allocation and contribution strategy that actually fits your real situation, rather than a generic one-size-fits-all default that was set up when you were half your current age. Let's also address a mistake that goes in the opposite direction, because it's just as common: becoming so afraid of market risk after 50 that you shift your entire 401k into something extremely conservative, essentially cash-like investments, far too early. This feels safe, but it carries its own serious risk. If you still have 20 or 30 years of retirement ahead of you, being too conservative too early means your money may not grow fast enough to keep up with inflation over that entire stretch. The goal isn't maximum safety, it isn't maximum growth either. The goal is a thoughtful balance, matched specifically to how many years you actually have until you'll need this money, and how many years you'll need it to last after that. So let's bring this together into a clear checklist you can actually act on this week. First, log in and review your current asset allocation. If it hasn't been touched in years, that's a problem worth addressing now, not later. Second, confirm you're contributing enough to capture your full employer match if one is offered. This is free money, and there's rarely a good reason to leave it unclaimed. Third, if you're 50 or older and have any room in your budget, look into increasing your contribution to take advantage of catch-up contribution limits. This is one of the most powerful underused tools available to you specifically at this stage of life. Fourth, track down any old 401k accounts from previous employers and seriously consider consolidating them either into your current plan or an IRA to simplify your overall strategy and potentially reduce fees. Fifth, check the expense ratios on the funds you're actually invested in and compare them to lower cost alternatives available within your same plan. Sixth, start thinking now, even if retirement is still 5 or 10 years away, about how your allocation will need to shift gradually toward more balance as you get closer to actually needing this money. Here's the bigger picture I want you to leave with. Your 401k isn't something you set up once and forget for 30 years. It's a living part of your financial plan that needs real attention, especially now in the decade or two right before retirement, when the decisions you make have the least amount of time to correct themselves if something goes wrong. The good news is, none of what we covered today requires drastic action or panic. It requires about an hour of your time, an honest look at what's actually happening inside that account, and a handful of specific, deliberate adjustments that can meaningfully change how secure your retirement actually feels. if this gave you a clearer sense of what to actually check in your own 401k. Follow along, because I share practical, real-life financial strategies made specifically for people building a secure and confident retirement. And tell me honestly in the comments, when's the last time you actually looked closely at your 401k allocation? Let's talk about it.